The first splash of summer arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sending ripples across Thomas Mercer's newly cleaned pool. Not the splash of an eager swimmer, or even the plunge of his Labrador retriever Rusty, who, despite repeated training, couldn't resist the crystalline water on hot days. No, this splash came from a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and bulging, that sailed over the fence dividing his property from the immaculate colonial revival next door. Thomas had been dozing in his lounge chair, the remnants of a long shift at the hospital still clinging to his consciousness, when the wet slap jolted him awake. He watched in disbelief as French fries floated to the surface like pale, sodden fingers reaching for air, while half-eaten burgers slowly sank to the bottom, trailing a murky cloud. "What the hell?" he muttered, pushing himself upright and squinting toward the fence. The distinctive cackle of Veronica Sheffield drifted over the 6-foot sear barrier, followed by the tinkling of ice in what Thomas knew would be her third gin and tonic of the afternoon. Veronica Sheffield, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood taste enforcer, had been a thorn in Thomas's side since he purchased the modest ranch-style home 18 months ago. His house was the smallest on Oakwood Lane, a fact that seemed to personally offend Veronica, who never missed an opportunity to remind him that property values were everyone's responsibility. Thomas waded into the pool and fished out the disintegrating bag, his scrubs getting soaked in the process. As he examined the trash, he noticed the receipt still attached to the bag. Dated today, with Veronica's credit card number clearly printed at the bottom. "Ms. Sheffield," he called, his voice controlled despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I think you dropped something in my pool." Silence greeted him, then the sound of the sliding door closing. Thomas climbed out of the pool, dripping and frustrated. This wasn't the first time trash had accidentally made its way over the fence. 3 weeks ago, it had been an empty wine bottle. Before that, landscaping debris from her gardener's work. Each incident followed the same pattern. Thomas's polite inquiries met with cold denial or condescending suggestions that perhaps the wind was to blame. Inside his kitchen, Thomas peeled off his wet clothes and tossed them into the laundry. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Harriman at the hospital. "Emergency shift, tomorrow 6 a.m. Rodriguez called in sick again." Thomas groaned. He'd been looking forward to his rare weekend off, his first in 6 weeks. The pool, which had cost nearly half his savings to install last spring, was supposed to be his refuge after the grueling hours as an ER nurse. Now it would need to be cleaned and shocked again before he could even think about enjoying it. As he scrubbed chlorine tablets into the skimmer basket, Thomas noticed Veronica through a gap in the fence. She was arranging pristine white cushions on her expansive patio furniture, preparing for what appeared to be yet another of her legendary garden parties. Her platinum blonde hair was freshly coiffed, and she wore the kind of casual sundress that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly mortgage payment. The contrast between his backyard, functional but modest, and her showpiece of outdoor living struck him anew. Her patio was a vision of coordinated perfection. Custom stonework, an outdoor kitchen that rivaled most indoor ones, and meticulously arranged potted plants that always seemed to bloom on command. It was the centerpiece of the annual Oakwood Lane Garden Tour, a fact Veronica never tired of mentioning. Thomas watched as she fastidiously adjusted a flower arrangement, barking orders at her housekeeper, who scurried to and fro with trays of appetizers. Tomorrow's gathering would undoubtedly include the neighborhood elite, the same people who had signed his third warning letter about his unsightly garbage bins being visible from the street for more than 12 hours. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across both yards, Thomas made a decision. The quiet rage that had been building for 18 months crystallized into something harder, more resolute. He was tired of being the neighborhood punching bag, tired of Veronica's thinly veiled contempt. "Enough," he whispered, dropping the pool net and staring at the fence dividing their properties. "This ends now." Thomas's 6 a.m. emergency shift stretched into 14 brutal hours. A multi-car pileup on the interstate had the ER bustling with trauma cases, leaving him no time to dwell on neighborhood disputes. By the time he dragged himself home at 8 that evening, his scrubs were spattered with blood, his eyes were rimmed red, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of lives he couldn't save. But as he turned onto Oakwood Lane, the strains of orchestral music and refined laughter drifting from Veronica's backyard jolted him from his exhaustion. The Sheffield garden party was in full swing. Cars lined both sides of the street, luxury vehicles that gleamed under the streetlights, forcing Thomas to park nearly a block away. He trudged up his driveway, keys jingling in his trembling hand, when a voice called out from the darkness. "Rough day, Mercer?" Walter Chen, his next-door neighbor on the other side, stood in his own driveway, taking out recycling. Unlike most residents of Oakwood Lane, Walter had always been friendly, a retired high school science teacher who minded his own business and occasionally shared vegetables from his garden. "Lost 2 today," Thomas replied, his voice hollow. "Young couple. Drunk driver T-boned them." Walter nodded solemnly. World keeps spinning anyway, doesn't it? He gestured toward Veronica's house, where fairy lights twinkled above the fence and the murmur of privileged conversation floated through the evening air. Thomas's jaw tightened. She threw McDonald's trash in my pool yesterday. Walter didn't seem surprised. Sheffield's been making enemies since you moved here 5 years ago. Before you, it was the Davenports. Poor Margaret nearly had a breakdown over Veronica's campaign against their non-regulation mailbox. He chuckled darkly. They moved to Phoenix last year. I'm not moving, Thomas said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. Didn't think you would. Walter hesitated, then added, just between us, there's a neighborhood text chain. A Sheffield survivor support group. Mostly complaints, occasional warnings when she's on the warpath about something. Want in? Thomas found himself smiling for the first time that day. Absolutely. Inside his house, Thomas stood under the shower until the hot water ran cold, washing away the day's tragedies. He checked his phone afterward to find he'd been added to a group chat with 13 neighbors. The most recent messages warned that Veronica had been discussing a proposed EHOA bylaw against above-ground pools, a thinly veiled attack on Thomas's recent installation. His pool, the one luxury he'd allowed himself after years of saving, the one place he could decompress after shifts where he literally held people's lives in his hands. Thomas walked to his kitchen window, which offered a partial view of Veronica's backyard. Her guests had migrated to the patio, where candlelight flickered across expensive outfits and carefully cultivated expressions of interest. Veronica stood in the center, gesturing emphatically, a diamond tennis bracelet catching the light with each movement. Thomas recognized several AHO board members nodding along with whatever she was saying. His gaze drifted to his own backyard. In the darkness, he could make out the outline of his pool, now clean again after hours of work yesterday. The pool that had cost him overtime shifts and missed holidays. The pool that represented small moments of peace and a life dedicated to others. Thomas's phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood chat. She's talking about you right now, Mercer. Something about declining neighborhood aesthetics and unfortunate exceptions to community standards. Direct quote. The cold clarity settled over Thomas. He opened his refrigerator and pulled out a beer, drinking it slowly as he stared out at the party. Another text came through. Vote on the pool bylaw scheduled for next Tuesday's AHOA meeting. Sheffield already has 4 votes lined up. Thomas set his beer down with a decisive click against the countertop. He spent his day fighting to save lives while Veronica spent hers fighting to make his miserable. The imbalance struck him as cosmically unjust. He stepped onto his back porch, the sounds of Veronica's party growing louder. From this angle, he could see her perfect patio in all its glory. The imported stone pavers she boasted about in the neighborhood newsletter, the custom fire pit where guests now gathered with champagne flutes, the immaculate white furniture arranged like a magazine spread. Thomas remembered something from his conversation with Walter. Before you, it was the Davenports, and before them, presumably others. Veronica's campaign against him wasn't personal. It was just what she did, who she was. A bully with social currency and too much time on her hands. The realization should have made him feel better. Instead, it crystallized his resolve. Thomas awoke before dawn the following Monday, his day off transformed into a covert operation. The neighborhood group chat had been buzzing all weekend with updates about Veronica's campaign against his pool. She'd been door-to-door collecting signatures for her petition, describing his modest backyard oasis as a mosquito-breeding eyesore and a liability to property values. Perfect timing, Thomas muttered as he sipped his coffee, watching the sky light into a pale gray. According to the group chat, Veronica had left yesterday for an overnight spa retreat in preparation for Tuesday's AHOA meeting, her monthly ritual of facials and massages that ensured she would look her decision-making best when rendering judgments on her neighbors' lives. Thomas dressed in dark jeans and a black t-shirt, then retrieved his tool bag from the garage. Inside were items accumulated over the weekend: PVC pipe sections, connectors, a small hand drill, waterproof epoxy, and several small wireless cameras he ordered with overnight shipping. His nursing salary would feel the pinch, but Thomas considered it an investment in his mental health. At 6:30 a.m., he sent a message to the neighborhood chat. Anyone have eyes on Sheffield property? Need to know if housekeeper is there yet. A reply came quickly from Diane Winters, an early riser 3 doors down. Coast is clear. Housekeeper's car usually appears around 9. You making your move, Mercer? Need backup. Thomas smiled at the solidarity. Solo mission, but stay on alert. The fence between their properties had been Veronica's idea, installed at her expense but strategically positioned 2 inches into Thomas' property to avoid permitting requirements. Now that petty maneuver worked in his favor. The narrow gap between fence and property line created a perfect access corridor. Thomas slipped through his side gate and edged along the fence line, tool bag in hand. The morning dew soaked through his shoes as he navigated the slim passage. At the corner of Veronica's yard, he paused, listening for any signs of activity from nearby houses. Only birdsong and the distant hum of early commuter traffic met his ears. The blueprints had shown exactly what he needed: the main water valve for Veronica's elaborate irrigation system, located just beyond the fence near a cluster of hydrangeas. Thomas carefully parted the flowers and found the valve box hidden beneath a decorative rock. This was the moment of truth. If Veronica had updated her system since filing the plans, his entire scheme might fail. Thomas held his breath as he opened the valve box. "Bingo," he whispered. The layout matched the blueprints perfectly. Thomas worked methodically, attaching a T-connector to the main line and adding a secondary valve, one he could control remotely. Next came the clever part: a length of flexible PVC that he threaded carefully along the fence line, concealed by Veronica's own meticulously maintained landscaping. The pipe led to a spot directly behind her showcase patio, where Thomas had identified the drainage system's most vulnerable point. According to the blueprints, Veronica's contractor had installed a sophisticated drainage network beneath the expensive stonework, channels designed to direct water away from the patio to prevent damage during heavy rains. Thomas was about to reverse that flow. With surgical precision, he connected his pipe to the drainage system's outflow point, creating a loop that could, when activated, force water back underneath the patio instead of away from it. The pressure wouldn't be immediately catastrophic. Nothing would crack or burst dramatically. Instead, it would create a slow, persistent seepage beneath the stones, gradually undermining the carefully leveled base. "Time for a test," Thomas murmured, checking his watch. He had been working for nearly 2 hours, and the neighborhood was waking up. He needed to finish before anyone noticed. Thomas attached a small wireless transmitter to his valve system and synced it to an app on his phone. With a tap, he opened the valve slightly, watching as water began flowing through his improvised pipeline. Another tap closed it again. Simple, effective, untraceable. The final touch was installing 2 tiny weatherproof cameras, one aimed at the patio, another at the valve box, disguised among Veronica's prized rhododendrons. These would allow Thomas to monitor the effects of his handiwork remotely and ensure nothing went catastrophically wrong. He wanted revenge, not destruction. As Thomas packed up his tools, his phone buzzed with a warning from the neighborhood chat. Sheffield's housekeeper just turned onto Oakwood. ETA, 2 minutes. Heart pounding, Thomas slipped back along the fence line and into his yard just as a silver Prius pulled into Veronica's driveway. He closed his gate silently behind him, adrenaline making his hands shake. The community center meeting room buzzed with uncharacteristic energy as Thomas slipped into a seat at the back. Oakwood Lane HOA meetings typically drew only the board members and perhaps 1 or 2 homeowners with specific grievances. Tonight, however, the room was nearly full. Thomas recognized faces from the neighborhood chat group, most offering subtle nods of solidarity as he passed. Their presence suggested word had spread about Veronica's crusade against his pool. He hadn't asked for this support, but the quiet alliance warmed him in ways his 16-hour trauma shift hadn't managed to chill. Outside, thunder rumbled, distant but approaching. The forecast had predicted severe thunderstorms starting around 8 p.m. It was 7:40. At the front of the room, Veronica Sheffield arranged papers at the head table, her platinum hair freshly styled, her posture rigid with authority. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly student loan payment. 4 other board members flanked her, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly uncomfortable. "She's been talking about you all day," whispered Diane Winters, sliding into the chair beside Thomas. "My gardener works for her on Tuesdays," said she was practicing her community standard speech while he trimmed her hedges. Thomas nodded, his attention split between the meeting and the weather app on his phone. The thunderstorm was accelerating, now predicted to hit at 7:55. "Anything I should know before this starts?" he asked quietly. Diane's expression turned grim. "She's got the votes locked in. This isn't really a discussion. It's an execution." Right on cue, Veronica tapped her gavel, calling the meeting to order with practiced authority. "Welcome to the May meeting of the Oakwood Lane Homeowners Association," she began, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who believed her words automatically carried weight. "We have several items on our agenda tonight, but I'd like to move directly to new business." A board member, Thomas recognized him as Phil Cortez, who owned the Tudor-style home at the end of the street, cleared his throat. "Veronica, we typically start with approval of previous minutes and the treasurer's report." Veronica's smile tightened. "Given the weather forecast, I thought we might prioritize matters requiring a vote." She gestured toward the windows where raindrops had begun to patter against the glass. "Unless you prefer to be caught in a deluge debating line items, Phil?" Cortez retreated and Veronica seized the momentum. The board has been presented with a petition concerning above-ground pools in our community, she continued, lifting a document with a flourish. Specifically, the petition addresses concerns about declining property values, aesthetic inconsistency, and potential safety hazards presented by temporary swimming structures. Thomas felt every eye in the room shift toward him momentarily. His phone vibrated, a notification from his camera app. The rain was intensifying at Oakwood Lane, droplets splashing against Veronica's immaculate patio stones. Perfect timing. Veronica was now reading aloud from her prepared statement, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. The proposed bylaw amendment would require all swimming pools to be in-ground, professionally landscaped, and subject to architectural review before installation. A loud crack of thunder punctuated her words, followed by a collective jump from the audience. The storm had arrived. Furthermore, Veronica continued, undeterred, any existing structures not meeting these standards would need to be removed within 30 days of this amendment's passage, or the homeowner would face daily fines off. Thomas's phone buzzed again. He glanced down to see the camera feed from Veronica's backyard. The rain was now coming down in sheets, water cascading off her roof and flowing toward the compromised drainage system he had engineered. It was time. Under the table, Thomas opened the valve app and slid the control to 50% open. On his screen, he could see the immediate effect. Water backing up in the drainage channels, seeking the path of least resistance, which now led directly beneath Veronica's showcase patio. "Miss Sheffield," Thomas called out, raising his hand. The interruption clearly irritated Veronica, whose mouth tightened to a thin line. "We're not at the discussion phase yet, Mr. Mercer," she replied coldly. "As I was saying, daily fines of $100 would be imposed until compliance is achieved. This amendment has the support of the majority of homeowners, as evidenced by—" Thomas woke before his alarm, the gray light of dawn barely filtering through his blinds. He reached immediately for his phone, checking the camera feeds from Veronica's yard with the anticipation of a child on Christmas morning. The scene exceeded his expectations. Overnight, the continued rain and his strategic manipulation of the drainage system had transformed Veronica's showcase patio from a minor cosmetic issue into what contractors would classify as significant structural compromise. Several stones had sunk noticeably, creating a depression in the center that collected water in a muddy puddle. The precisely measured gaps between pavers had widened in some places, narrowed to nothing in others. The perfect symmetry that Veronica had bragged about in 3 separate HOA newsletters was now a warped, uneven surface. But that was just the opening act. Thomas dressed quickly in his running clothes, a normal part of his routine that wouldn't raise suspicions, and collected the items he prepared yesterday before the HOA meeting. A large garbage bag filled with carefully curated contents, rubber gloves, and a disposable rain poncho. The neighborhood was silent as Thomas began his morning jog, circling the block once before cutting through the small wooded area that backed up to both his and Veronica's properties. The storm had left everything sodden, mud sucking at his running shoes as he made his way through the trees to the spot he identified yesterday, a natural blind spot between properties where neither security cameras nor nosy neighbors could observe his activities. Thomas donned the poncho and gloves, then retrieved the garbage bag from where he stashed it beneath a fallen log. Inside was a collection that had taken considerable effort to assemble. McDonald's wrappers identical to those Veronica had thrown in his pool, coffee grounds, banana peels, eggshells, and other kitchen scraps he'd been collecting in a sealed container for days. The piece de resistance was a small jar of pool water he'd skimmed after Veronica's latest contribution to his backyard, complete with floating French fries preserved in their greasy glory. Thomas checked his phone one final time. The camera feed showed Veronica's kitchen light now on, the housekeeper having arrived for her early morning duties. Veronica herself would still be asleep. Her daily schedule, often loudly announced at neighborhood functions, included beauty rest until 8:30, followed by coffee on the patio, weather permitting. Weather would definitely not permit today, but Thomas had other plans for that patio. Moving stealthily along the fence line, Thomas reached the corner of Veronica's property where he'd installed his drainage modification. The saturated ground made his work easier as he dug a small trench with a garden trowel, extending his pipe network a few crucial feet to emerge at the lowest point of Veronica's now sunken patio. Thomas connected a funnel attachment to the pipe end, secured it with waterproof tape, and began emptying the contents of his garbage bag into the funnel. The mixture of food waste and grimy pool water disappeared into the pipe, gravity carrying it beneath the fence and directly toward the depression in Veronica's patio. On his phone, Thomas watched the camera feed with satisfaction as the first signs of his special delivery appeared, murky liquid seeping up between the patio stones, bringing with it bits of decomposing food and soggy fast food wrappers. The depression in the center of the patio was now filling with a revolting stew of garbage, forming a small, fetid pond. in what had once been the neighborhood's most photographed outdoor living space. Thomas emptied the last of his collection, the preserved French fries from his pool, and watched as they floated to the surface of the garbage pond, coming to rest in a pattern that seemed almost artistic in its disgusting symmetry. "Return to sender," Thomas whispered, dismantling his funnel setup and covering the pipe end with soil. He removed his gloves and poncho, stuffing them into his empty garbage bag, and jogged back through the wooded area to complete his morning exercise routine. As Thomas reached his driveway, he noticed Walter Chen retrieving his newspaper, eyebrows raising at Thomas's mud-splattered running clothes. "Trails are pretty messy after the storm," Thomas called by way of explanation. Walter nodded slowly, a knowing look crossing his features. "Funny thing about water," he remarked casually, "it always finds the lowest point, almost like it has a mind of its own sometimes." Thomas suppressed a smile. Nature can be unpredictable. Indeed. Walter glanced toward Veronica's house. "Should be an interesting morning on Oakwood Lane." Thomas showered and made coffee, positioning himself at his kitchen window with a clear view of Veronica's back door. The neighborhood chat group had been unusually quiet, suggesting either that no one had yet